Okay, so we might kick off. Welcome everyone to this session today on protecting women and children in the situation in Afghanistan. I'll be chairing the session today. My name is Dr. Shireen Daft. But before I get started, I'm going to hand over to Sarah Williams to introduce herself and her role in kicking off this series. Sarah?
Great, thanks, Shireen. So my name is Sarah Williams. I'm a professor here in the Faculty of Law and Justice at UNSW, and I'm also an associate member of the Australian Institute for Human Rights, which are co-hosting today's event. So I was going to start, in Australia, it's customary that we would commence a public meeting with either an acknowledgement of country or welcome to country. So it's slightly more complicated when people are joining us from all around the world, but we'll proceed with our tradition, and I hope you appreciate why we do so. So I'm based in Glebe, which is a suburb of Sydney. And this is I'm on the traditional land of the Gadigal people. So I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people, the traditional owners and custodians of this land. I'd also like to pay my respects to the elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to any other Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders who may be joining us today. If you are joining us from somewhere in Australia, I'd urge you just to, normally we would post it in the chat, but I just urge you to think and to acknowledge privately the owners of the land upon which you are joining us from. And similarly, if you're overseas and you have your own Indigenous populations and own ceremonies that you'd like to acknowledge traditional owners there as well. So thank you. It also falls to me on behalf of the Australian Human Rights Institute and also the Faculty of Law and Justice and UNSW itself to welcome you to what looks to be an extremely interesting session on protecting the vulnerable in armed conflict, and particularly looking at the role of international humanitarian law and human rights law. So we're delighted to partner with the Australian Red Cross on this initiative. We've come in to host the final 3 sessions in this series of events on Afghanistan. We've had a really long history of collaborating with the Australian Red Cross, and given the COVID interruptions, it's really lovely to be getting back involved with that collaboration again. We've had various collaborations around research, delivery of courses. In fact, I've got someone from the Australian Red Cross coming to talk to my IHL class next week. And then we've had a history of doing these types of events whenever there are current issues that need to be discussed. We're very happy to provide a public forum for those issues to be debated. So I'm really grateful to Janet and her colleagues at the Australian Red Cross for giving us the opportunity to be involved in this seminar series and to kind of foster that relationship again. Now, in particular, this seminar series, with its focus on Afghanistan, it's obviously particularly significant and it's timely. We know our own government, the Australian government, was had extensive engagement in Afghanistan, and we know that Australian organisations and individuals are they're at the forefront of providing humanitarian and other assistance to those who are affected. We're also engaged in supporting and advocating for human rights for those who both have left and those who remain. And so I think it's essential that we keep our focus on Afghanistan and continue to support those performing those very vital roles as much as we can. So that's another reason I'm thrilled that we can be involved. I guess as well as we must also mention that any event that's discussing protection of the vulnerable in armed conflict, particularly women and children, it obviously has particular resonance as we look at what's happening in the world today and the reports of serious violations coming out of Ukraine. So we must continue to explore together ways that we can support those who are on the front line, who are trying to protect and to support those in conflict zones, and explore the role that international humanitarian law can play in those types of situations, and make sure it's not sidelined in the politics and the seriousness of those situations, and also to highlight accountability for those that are responsible, particularly important topic as we look at what's happening in Ukraine today. So I thank you for your commitment, those of you who are at the forefront of these endeavours. I think your commitment to assisting those people in need, your commitment to human rights and to humanitarian law in Afghanistan and elsewhere. And I'm looking at your panel. You have a wonderful panel, very experienced, very expert, and you'll have a lot to discuss. So with that, I'll pass back to Shireen, but I wish you all the best for very fruitful and productive discussions today, and hope that we see the impact of this in the field. So thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you, Sarah, for that introduction, and for UNSW for hosting this session today. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge that I'm presenting from the land of the Wallumattagal people of the Darug Nation, who have nurtured this land since the dream time, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and enduring, as this always was and always will be their land. So before I go any further, as mentioned, I'm Shireen and chairing the session. I should start by saying I'm speaking entirely in my own capacity today, and in no way speaking on behalf of the Australian Red Cross. Not that I plan to say anything particularly outrageous, I hope, but just to acknowledge the principle of humanity that is so core to the ethos of the Red Cross and is so essential to their ability to work with all parties to a conflict in all conflicts across the world. So I'm absolutely not speaking on their behalf, so anything I say is only to be accounted for. I'm the only one accountable for it. So I've been asked to speak today to basically set the scene for our speakers and to talk about the role of international humanitarian law in protecting the vulnerable in conflict situations. And I thought, like Sarah, to start by pointing out that it seems particularly timely to talk about the relevance of the laws governing armed conflicts right now. But the sad reality is it is always timely. There are always conflicts raging across the world, and Afghanistan is an example of a country that has experienced very little peace in recent decades. It has been estimated that there are currently at least 2 billion people around the world that are living in situations of conflict or extreme violence. So with women representing more than half the global population, that's approximately 1 billion women living in conflict situations. When it comes to children, different studies give different numbers, but it's estimated that somewhere between 1 in 5 to 2/3 of all children are living in conflict-affected areas of the globe. Now, when I teach IHL to my students, I emphasize the nuances and the complexity of the law. But when it comes to the space of protecting the vulnerable, IHL is very simple. Civilians are not a target. It is never, ever okay for a civilian who is not participating in the fighting in a conflict zone to be the target of an attack. The law is unambiguous on this point. And aside from the general provisions protecting the civilian population, IHL provides specific protections for women and for children. In the case of women, provisions of the law provide that women shall be the object of special respect and that they shall be treated with all consideration due to their sex. Elsewhere, the law states that all protected people are to be treated equally without adverse distinction based on, among other things, their gender. The acknowledgement of special respect is an acknowledgement that the ways in which women experience conflict can differ from the experiences of men. And I look forward to hearing from our first two speakers today and from our final panelist, Satara, on the ways in which the lived experience of women in conflict zones is unique and the ways in which special respect may be required. As Judith Gardam has pointed out, war exacerbates the inequalities that exist in different forms and to varying degrees in all societies. So if women can't find equality and safety in peacetime, it is next to impossible in armed conflict. There are also specific protections within IHL recognising and prohibiting the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war, as we know that this remains all too common, and providing special protections to the needs of pregnant women and mothers of young children. When it comes to children, it is widely recognised that children are disproportionately affected by conflict and are particularly vulnerable to particular means of warfare as well, such as the use of landmines. Children are highly resilient, but children in conflict zones are at very high risk of experiencing violence, the loss of their education, hunger, limited access to basic resources, and all sorts of forms of trauma. The United Nations Security Council, which does give a special attention to the issue of children affected by armed conflict, note that there are 6 particular categories of grave violations that IHL seeks to protect children against, but which remain very, very prevalent in conflicts today. These are the recruitment and use of child soldiers, the killing and maiming of children, sexual violence, attacks against schools and hospitals, the abduction of children, and the denial of humanitarian assistance. In 2021, the United Nations verified an overall number of 26,425 individual accounts of these grave violations occurring against children around the world in the preceding year, with Afghanistan noted as one of the most serious hotspots for this violence to occur. We know in particular, for example, that the intersection of our two topics today, women and children, makes girls particularly vulnerable in Afghanistan, with girls' education having become a particular target. This makes the work of those working in humanitarian organisations working on the ground dedicated to the concerns of children vitally important, such as our speakers today from the Save the Children and World Vision. So without further ado, I want to turn the proverbial microphone over to our panellists for today. Our session will run with each panellist having approximately 7 minutes or so to make their opening remarks. I've been asked to police this closely, so please forgive me in advance for any interruptions that I do need to make to our panellists for the sake of timekeeping. While our speakers are talking, we invite you to please submit your questions via the Q&A button on your Zoom screen. We ask that you do use the Q&A option rather than the chat function if you could, please. After all of our speakers have made their opening remarks, we will turn this session over to your questions and give our panellists the opportunity to engage with your questions and concerns as they are brought up. So to begin, unfortunately, our originally advertised first speaker, Dipmala Mala from CARE International, is no longer available to join us, but her colleague Victor Moses, who is Country Director for CARE Afghanistan, has kindly stepped in and agreed to speak to us today. So I'd like to now turn over to you, Victor. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Shireen, and I thank you and all the organizers for giving this opportunity to share on the status of women and girls in Afghanistan. I have a screen to share. Can you let me know if you can see the screen?
Hi, Victor. It says that your screen's sharing, but we can't actually see anything.
I'm sharing the screen. Let me see.
Now it's working. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. As I said, once again, thank you. Let me start with a question that every woman and every girl in Afghanistan asks to all of us. Will you ignore me? That's a voice from Afghanistan. I learned lots of points in the slides, but I may not go through all of them, but you have it on record for future use. I would like to start with the consequences of the economic crisis. Within that, access to food remains a principal concern. And I base my data based on what is published by UN NGOs, also by CARE, which took a multi-sector need assessment and published in February. So some of the data comes from there. So food security is the highest 72% of the respondents that we asked as the main concern. Lack of employment and opportunities, livelihood and economic empowerment, lack of access to humanitarian aid was seen as the voices from the communities. As I speak to you, 22.8 million people, almost half or over half of the population are facing acute hunger. The basic food items, the cost of it has gone double or more higher than what it was 6 months back. Because of this, our survey clearly, our assessment clearly indicates that large number of households are not able to buy the goods that they need for the basic survival. I move on. If that is the context, which has been mentioned as well as by Shireen and publicly available in various documents and the media has highlighted, what is the coping mechanism that we see among the women and girls? As I said, the combination of food insecurity, poverty, income loss, displacement, COVID, drought, severe winter, and ongoing insecurity has triggered a negative coping behaviors among women and girls, among all and particularly for women and girls. When I talk about food insecurity, it specifically affects and uniquely affects the women and girls. In a culture where feeding male family members comes first, the women tend to have even less and less frequently than men. The phenomenon is particularly concerning when it comes to pregnant and lactating women who have special nutritional needs. Our assessment carried out in 2021 clearly finds out that women are less likely to have balanced diet than comparing to men. Other coping mechanism which we are aware in and has been reported of women and girls include not sending the girls to school, resorting to child labor and early marriage, as well as instances of selling daughters. And also they have stopped seeking medical care because they cannot afford. Displacement is another coping mechanism that you see, a high number of displaced within the country, as well as they take refugee outside the country. Here, Afghanistan is currently doing a research which will be ended by July, how food insecurity is affecting specifically women and children. The third point I would like to say is about mobility and access. This is very basic that affects women. Even before pre-COVID, because of long-standing culture and gender expectation, women's role was restricted to household, particularly in rural and conservative areas. During COVID, this mobility restriction due to lockdown also was affected. Now, women's mobility has become significantly restricted due to further exclusion from the public sphere through imposition of restriction on women's movements without a mahram, for example. 75 kilometers and above, you need to have a male accompanying a woman. Our field health workers and aid workers, they are allowed to carry out their task if they wear a hijab or accompanied by a mahram. All this deeply affect women's access, the basic access to employment, to education and mobility.
Victor, sorry, you've just muted yourself. If we could get you to unmute, sorry.
Sorry. Thank you for that. Access to education. When it comes to access to education, we are very happy with the announcement of the de facto government that from March end, women or girls will return to school. That's a great thing. We would like to see how that is demonstrated. However, our assessment says girls are struggling to attend school. 68% of the school age children, girls, were not attending to school. In comparison to 2020, where 52% of school age were not enrolled. However, even if the schools do reopen, the challenges still remain. The economic challenges, which were the main reason for preventing children to go to school, will still remain. The lack of female teachers will still be there. Unavailability of schools will still be there. And the whole social taboo, cultural barriers that not allowing girls to go to school will still remain. So therefore, access to education, even though there may be an access coming on the way, still will have challenges. When it comes to gender-based violence, the situation was already bad before the regime change. With the weak implementation of the elimination of violence against women earlier, now it is almost doesn't exist. The ministry no more exists, the Ministry for Women. Within this context, when care assessment shows a reduction in access to specialized services since the onset of COVID-19 from 1922 onwards. Our gender analysis done by CARE in Afghanistan found that gender-based violence, particularly intimate to partner violence and child early and post marriages, have increased with the 2021 drought. And our 2022 multi-sector needs assessment found that up to 88% of women said that male unemployment had driven an increase in the gender-based violence. What we also see is the greater risk and recorded and reported gender-based violence, and they are not having the services because those services which were available earlier are either minimal or not available. What do we do as care? Just to highlight, as I painted this picture, with other INGOs and UN, we have a mobile health team that care is working to bring critical services to the communities. We provide food assistance as well as non-food assistance to people. We provide multi-purpose cash assistance for the most vulnerable. Also, we provide cash for work that they carry out some work that benefits the communities. We also provide support to small-scale farmers. Therefore, in the coming months, the food security can improve itself. Because of the current winter, which is fortunately getting over, but it was very, very harsh. We provided blankets, gloves, hats, and other essential items for the people, particularly for women and girls, to cope up with the winter. With this, I would like to end with this question. While the women and girls in Afghanistan thank you for giving this opportunity to speak out on their behalf, their voice. They thank you for not ignoring this particular webinar demonstrates that they are not ignored. They will continue to wait for you and wait for all of us. Let's reach out before it is too late. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victor. The importance of your work in Afghanistan just reminds me of the importance of how important it is to ensure respect and protection for those providing humanitarian assistance, not just for the protection of those humanitarian workers, but to protect communities from starvation, to ensure the care of the sick and the wounded and the like. I think it's also really worthwhile what you were talking about. I think the less direct effects of conflict, the way it impacts in the long term on things like food security and employment, does not get enough attention. So thank you for drawing attention to those issues. I would like to now turn over to our next speaker, who is Semin Qasmi. Semin is currently working as a program advisor for the Australian Red Cross, but today she'll be speaking to us from the perspective of her previous work with UN Women and their work in Afghanistan. Semin, please.
Thank you very much, Shireen. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land from where I'm joining this meeting today and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. As you rightly noted, Shireen, I'm currently working with the Australian Red Cross, but I was with UN Women until a few weeks ago, so I'm not representing UN Women here today, but I'll be sharing some of the work that UN Women does in Afghanistan and the work that I was part of. So given the need in the country, the biggest focus of UN Women's work in Afghanistan is on violence against women programming, which focuses on the protection and prevention of violence against women and girls. Unfortunately, violence against women has been a constant feature of life for many Afghan women. Even before August 15, before like political change, rates of violence against women were extremely high. There were data that indicated that 87% of Afghan women experienced at least one form of abuse in their lifetime. While during pandemic, this is increased even further. Oxfam conducted a survey during pandemic and reported that 97% of the respondents had experienced an increase in gender-based violence since the beginning of the outbreak. So the issue is of endemic nature. UN Women has been supporting services for survivors of violence for many years. Before the Taliban takeover, there were shelters and family guidance centers in 25 provinces out of 34 provinces. 25 had women protection centers or shelters and family guidance centers, and these centers or service points were providing women survivors of violence and their children with safe shelter, psychosocial support, counseling, health services, legal services, education, and economic empowerment opportunities. Also, a lot was done at the national level to address violence against. Significant gains were also made in the last 20 years. So the legal architecture supporting women's rights had improved, and ending violence against women law is a good example because it did improve the legal accountability for gender-based violence. There were also ending violence against women prosecution units that were established in a number of provinces, and there were also family response units at the law enforcement institutions across all the country that could be considered as really significant gains. However, things were not perfect. There were still issues with accessibility. Services were not provided, or there were no services in the far parts of the country due to security reasons. Mainly the services were available at the capital level of at the provincial capitals. And reaching out to the people at the far off parts of the country was an issue. But with the takeover of Taliban, access to these services further deteriorated, while the needs for services increased. After August 15, there were only 2 shelters that were providing services to the survivors of violence were operational in Kabul, while the rest all had to shut down or close. Service providers reported threats, and they were targeted for their work in support of women and girls, and many providers were forced to close their doors, and leaving a lot of women who needed help without really help. And as we all know, in every crisis, violence against women spikes when women are homes. Also, multiple displacements by carefully, loss of livelihood, increase in poverty, inflation, skyrocketing prices of daily, necessities, are all compounding factors that increases women and girls' vulnerability to violence. And we have also seen this in the last few months. There are increased rates of child marriage reported due to economic insecurity. So these are all the issues around violence against women in Afghanistan. But we have also realized in the last 6 or so months that there's always need for these services, and even the de facto government of Afghanistan that was opposing having some of these shelters, there were talks a few months ago with some government officials where they indicated they realized that there are needs for these shelters and there needs to be established. However, there were still a few, and I think there still might be issues for them to have a clear indication of whether these services need to start or not. But of course, there were messages coming from there, and that these services, there needs to be services for women who are in need, particularly survivors of violence. But what UN Women did, and based on the discussions with a lot of their partners, they had to actually come up with a different modality for these centers. Violence against women is a very sensitive issue in Afghanistan. It's not always, and it's never been an easy topic to talk. Even prior to August 15, there were some conservative elements in the society that didn't want, they were against these services. So UN Women and other stakeholders who are in this sector had to work and come up with different modality for these services. And they're currently, I guess, also working on establishing the services, but with a slightly different model that could provide access also to the women who in the last few years didn't have the access. At the macro level, well, there are reports also from UN and other entities that security situation at the macro level has improved a little bit, because in the past, the main issue with insecurity was the insurgent group, Taliban themselves. While now they are in the government, they are actually running the government. So they're not the issue of the kind of security issues that existed in the past. Probably they are not of that nature anymore. So there are more opportunities for expanding the services to those parts of the country where security was a big issue, like to far parts of the country and at district levels. So there are now opportunities, and there, of course, as I noted, there are needs for these services to be available for all women across the country. However, I think one of the things that needs to be kept in mind, or maybe I should just mention that what makes it really difficult to have operations by the service providers, because these service providers were mainly run by women, and women, we know that there were and there are still restrictions on women to get back to work, and it's really important that opportunities are provided to women and they're able to get back, and because they are the ones who are providing services to the women who are in need. So women's participation at the at the social level, where they have the opportunity to work, where they are able to participate in political sphere is really important. So yeah, I want to end here, and I'm sure there will be questions, and I'll be happy to answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Semin. Of course, I didn't note earlier the fact that we're also really timely in terms of having this conversation today, when a week ago it was International Women's Day. And the UN theme for International Women's Day this year was Equality Today for a Sustainable Tomorrow. And obviously sustainability tends to be thought of entirely in environmental considerations. But I think in conflict situations and the situation of Afghanistan, what you were talking about, Semin, really emphasizes that importance of enduring solutions for women that will actually survive change and the pursuit of peace as well, and the importance of that, of being a sustainable peace. So thank you for your talk today. Now moving to the issues of protecting children, I'd like to introduce Asuntha Charles, who is the National Director of World Vision Afghanistan, to provide an overview of the work that World Vision provides for Afghani children. Asuntha.
Thank you so much, Shireen, and good morning, everyone. And I'm now joining you from Herat, one of the provinces in Afghanistan. So love and greetings from my Afghan communities. So I want to start my discussion with something that I see every day on the ground, because whenever you search for anything on Afghanistan, you see number of datas. Like numbers are always available, and these are not numbers. Behind the numbers, there are individuals, there are children, there are women. And sometimes we forget those individuals, their numbers become very important to us. But today I want to talk to you a scenario that disturbs me every day. Like when I walk or when I travel from my guest house to the office, what I see on the streets is increased number of children begging, and increased number of children just standing by the gutter, standing by the huge dustbins that are kept on the roadside. And this pains me a lot, because they are looking for food that has been thrown out from people. That's how the crisis in this country is. So my only worry is, are we allowing the children of Afghanistan to lose their childhood rights? The rights to play, the rights to educate, the rights to live a happy life and a peaceful life. And imagine children just waiting to pick up food that has been thrown out, that has been wasted by a number of people, just wash it and eat it. Are these children deserve this kind of a treatment? They have been suffering. This country has been suffering for the past 40 years with conflict, poverty, climate change, every other factor. And today, because of the political change, the children are facing the consequences. And they are feeling they are not getting proper food. So, and we have seen, like I myself have witnessed, which I have shared in different platforms. In IDP camps, children, especially girl children, are being sold. And you can get a child for a price of $500 to $2,000. It's like buying a cow or a goat in the market. So children are becoming the extreme victims of the situation on the ground. And it is estimated that around 4.7 million people are suffering from acute malnutrition in 2022. And what I have seen in my own mobile health clinics is women highly malnourished, pregnant, and they are sitting there waiting to deliver a baby. And I'm not sure whether this woman will ever survive the delivery. And even if she survives, what about the health status of the child that's going to be delivered? The child is going to be highly malnourished. And we know around 1 million children are in the verge of dying. So my worry is, how is the future generation, the next generation, what's the mental capacity of the next generation is going to be when they are so much affected even from their childhood, so highly malnourished. And I know a mother shedding tears because holding a 2 months old child in her hand, not able to provide her breast milk. The children are not getting breastfeeding today. And this is really causing a bigger problem on the malnutrition rate. And in our mobile health clinics, we are seeing relapsed cases. This is becoming a constant recurrence because we are treating them, but when they go back to the families, they are not having sufficient food. They are not having sufficient nutritious food. So the nutrition cases that we are treating are getting relapsed. And we know around 18.1 million are in need of health assistance because of the chaos in the health sector. And in this, 3.19 million are children who are under 5 years old. And whenever I go to the mobile health clinics, I see the numbers are really constantly increasing. And people don't mind traveling 5 kilometers, 10 kilometers, just to find these health facilities to treat their children. And we also know, even in the past, only 42% of Afghans had access to safe drinking water. And I really want to point out this because ultimately getting drinking water to the families becomes the responsibility of children. And we have conducted our own survey which says children are unable to go to schools because they are also given the job of getting drinking water from the families. So they have to walk kilometers to get water to help the families. So drinking water becomes a problem, which also has issues on the rights of children. And because children are having other jobs to do, they are losing their childhood. And this water has also a direct impact on the health condition. And we are seeing a lot of diarrheal cases and a lot of waterborne diseases because now children have no access to safe drinking water. So this is the desperate situation in which we are living. Every day we are seeing that children are becoming victims of major violence. And when you say children are being sold, especially girl children are being sold, they are getting married. So they are getting into issues of lot of sexual violence, physical violence, and they don't even have a future. Their future is totally darkened because at the age of 5 and 6, they are just sold to a man who is like a grandfather to them. And ultimately, they end up being a slave in someone's house, just meeting all their needs and being abused, losing their own childhood. And at the end, we have to say, are the children protected in this country? With no food, with no healthcare facilities, no education opportunities, as already one of the speaker mentioned, we are yet to see whether girls will be offered education in this country. It stands as a promise. So what happens on the reality will be a bigger question. And even if children are allowed to go to school, does this country has the sufficient capacity? Because we have sent out all the educated teachers. All the educated teachers have moved out. So what is the capacity that we have to meet the segregated classrooms? How are we going to offer classes to these children? Are we not going to have compromises on the quality of the children for the next generation? And these children are supposed to be developing this country. So in whose hands are the future development of this country is going to be if children are not given focus at this point of time, which is highly crucial. So looking at all the crises and the challenges on the ground, what is World Vision doing? We have been in this country for the past 21 years. We are spread mostly in the Western provinces and based in Herat, which is our head office, which also helps us to be very closer to the communities. We work in Herat, Badghis, Gor, and Faria, and covering 46 districts and 361 villages. And we also have around 500 regular staff who are national staff who are supporting us even after the political change, with a determination, with a commitment to serve this population. So with the health situation, knowing that there is a big crisis, we are carrying out about 21 mobile health and nutrition clinics all over these 4 provinces. And we also have 12 family health houses. So these are the ones through which we are supporting the health condition of the children, vaccinations, psychosocial support, nutritional support, and also healthcare support to pregnant and lactating mothers. So these are the services that are offered through our community health clinics, where mental health is taken into consideration. So regular counseling is given to women and especially to women and to both the parents. And also we have been focusing on water situation in the country. So providing safe water to the families is one of our major focus. So people have been drinking from open springs and open wells. So now we are trying to promote gravity-fed water supplies, through which water supplies come to the communities. And in some cases, we also provide house-to-house water supply. So taps are provided. So this also helps us to make sure that children can go to school, but not searching for water. And we undertake a lot of food security programs, which is food distribution, cash for work, which helps the families to earn their own income so that children are protected and children have a right to live a peaceful and happy life, so that the families are able to earn, so that children are not used as child laborers. So this is something that we promote so that we ensure there is family income that reduces violence against children. And we also support a lot of kitchen gardens so that after the treatment, the families are able to take care of the nutritional food supply to the children. And protection is one of the core areas for World Vision in this country, understanding that children are the worst victims of many abuses. So we have been working very closely with the faith leaders and community members so that we gain a lot of community support in reaching out to the children and make sure every child is protected. And coming to the end of my talk, I just want to highlight one issue. On March 1st, the UN launched a 1.7 billion appeal for Ukraine, of which 1.5 billion has already been raised in just 2 weeks. On January 11th, the UN launched a 4.4 billion appeal for Afghanistan, of which only 13% is funded. This is around 570 million. Just a question to the global community. are we forgetting the Afghan children who have gone through a lot of challenges for the past 40 years and who are still continuing to struggle? Can we understand the crisis all over the world, but the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan is something very, very unique. And this has affected more than half of the population of this country, and especially the children who are the future generation. Can we just make sure? Let us keep to the humanitarian principle of remaining neutral and reach out wherever there is crisis. Let us not abandon Afghanistan. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Asuntha. And that perspective is absolutely heartbreaking of what's actually happening to children on the ground. And I just want to echo your point that children are the future. If we actually want to have peace in any country such as Afghanistan, children need to be supported and provided an education so that they can be that next generation and see change in these countries. And that obviously is not currently possible. So everything that can be done should be done. Now I'd like to introduce Zola Maddison, who works for Save the Children as their humanitarian policy and advocacy advisor, to provide some insight on the work that Save the Children does with children in Afghanistan. Zola?
Thanks so much. So Save the Children has been working in Afghanistan since 1976. In 2020 alone, Save reached over 1.6 million Afghans. But currently, our operations on the ground have about 2,000 staff working across 10 provinces. In October of 2021, Save the Children upgraded our Afghanistan response to a Category 1, which is the highest priority across our organization and allows us to mobilize further resources and activate a movement-wide response from Save offices globally. So I first want to talk from the perspective of what we're hearing directly from our Afghanistan office, focusing on our current activities around education and protection and some of the biggest needs and concerns that we're seeing. And we'll also touch on some of the work that we're doing here in Australia from a policy and advocacy perspective. So we, like many of my colleagues here today, have conducted a multi-sector needs assessment, which really strongly pointed to the need for robust education. There's been so many points already made about this, but I wanted to share some of the findings from the survey. We surveyed 1,400 households across 6 regions, and girls compared to boys are disproportionately affected in their education. Just within this survey, 51% of girls versus 21% of boys were not attending school. Almost 40% of these households reported that girls aged 10 to 18 were not in school, and 30% of their girls aged 5 to 9 were not in school. Most of the households reported that the reason for this was a financial reason. They simply could not afford to send their children to school. 30% cited the need to have their children stay home to help with chores. 40% said that they were not in school because of a lack of teachers to teach them. 20% said they had let their children take paid work in the last 30 days. And almost 5% of these parents said they had arranged for their daughters to be married. We know that education is one of the cornerstones of the conventions of the rights of the child, yet there are roughly 10 million children in Afghanistan who are at risk of dropping out of school if teacher salaries cannot be paid. If we can keep these children in school, they are less likely to go into child labor. They're less likely to be married off. In 2021, Save the Children reached 500,000 children directly with education support. And since September of 2021, we've reached over 57,000 children with education services. But the programs that we're working on with Save the Children are not simply around direct support. While we are delivering robust community-based education, and we're looking for pathways for the CBE community-based education to move into traditional education. We're also working with the Ministry of Education to work on things like school improvement plans, developing teacher competency frameworks. And we have a specific program for young women training female graduates to become female teachers. We're really looking at addressing that teacher pipeline issue that we see staring us in the face right now. We know that last month, February, there was a positive development with universities opening across the country for both men and women. We also know that that schooling is gender segregated, dress codes were enforced, and that many students were reporting lecturers and professors were missing, likely as a result of the recent evacuations and departures from Afghanistan. And so we're really looking now to next week, to the 21st of March, when secondary schools are due to reopen. The de facto authorities have made a number of statements affirming their commitment to letting girls return to school, but they are also providing lots of caveats here, citing things like capacity challenges in their ability to implement safe, gender segregated schooling. And so we are both programmatically trying to ensure that we are supporting the de facto authorities in getting trained teachers. And from a policy perspective, we are really advocating at the nation state level to apply pressure to uphold their promises to allow girls back to school. It has been 6 months since girls have been in school, and we want to make sure that they're able to return. The other thing I'll note is around protection. We know that the Global Protection Cluster has recently come out with a report last month citing severe protection risks, which we've heard a lot about, reflecting the decades of conflict and violence that are being further exacerbated by food security, insecurity issues, and the conflict and violence and protection issues are really becoming entrenched. The risk of child recruitment has tripled in the world from 1990 to 2020. And Afghanistan, Syria, and Yemen were the top 3 countries in the world. In 2020, Afghanistan had a 98% chance of risk for child recruitment. Now, Semin, I think it was you who mentioned that as we see the de facto authorities move into more of a robust governing role, we're also seeing violence decrease. And so I'm hoping that we will also see some of those numbers around child recruitment go down, but it's something that we're watching. Save the Children has set up 12 child-friendly spaces across Nangarhar and Kandahar provinces. These spaces are places for children to play and to learn, to build resilience, and really just be children. We have trained psychosocial support for children as a result of these complex challenges that they're facing. We've also been able to resume our case management work. So this involves identifying children who are at risk of neglect, exploitation, violence, or abuse. And we work on action plans to help them overcome challenges. Additionally, we have 367 community-based child protection networks running across 7 provinces. So I think I'll stop there in terms of just our programming, but to quickly note that, you know, from the national level, from the domestic level, Save the Children Australia has been very engaged, working with DFAT and working with Parliament through their Senate inquiry into Australia's engagement in Afghanistan. We've been able to submit both a recommendation and supplementary recommendations, and have appeared in 2 public hearings for senators. And we're looking forward to that report being released fairly soon here. And a lot of our recommendations have focused on child protection, access to education, applying a principled response, humanitarian response to these crises. But we're also, within the last few months, really looking to lift some of the structural barriers to the Afghanistan people being able to access funds. Liquidity of funds has been one of the largest challenges that we're hearing about. And so being able to work with banks to ensure that organizations like World Vision and CARE and Save the Children are actually able to roll out operations and provide the good services that they do. So I'll stop there and turn it back over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zola. And what amazing work that we know that your organisation does do. And thank you for providing that little uplifting thing about what Australia is doing in this particular space, because unfortunately, when we hear about Afghanistan, it's mostly been the negative roles that Australia has played in that particular context. So our final panelist today is Sitarah Mohammadi. Satara is currently a legal researcher with the Afghanistan Human Rights Democracy Organisation. She'll be providing us today with her perspective, both in terms of her work, but particularly in terms of her own experiences living and growing up in Afghanistan. Thank you, Satara.
Thanks, Lynn. I would also like to acknowledge the land from which I'm joining you today, the Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. So the story of women and children in Afghanistan over the preceding quarter century, and especially during the past 20 years, is one of extremes. From relative tranquility and emancipation to violence, privation, and oppression, and lately at least the first steps back again. To put the current situation of women and girls into perspective, it is worth noting that the degree of oppression suffered by women under the Taliban is an abbreviation in modern Afghan history. It is true that before the Taliban took over in 1996, Afghanistan was a conservative society where women often had traditional roles. Nonetheless, in the 1970s, women made up a significant portion of all teachers in the country and a smaller but significant percentage of all doctors, civil servants, teachers, and nurses. Over the past 20 years of foreign intervention in the country, women worked for and gained substantial rights and opportunities. Women were active and working in all aspects of life in the country. Minority women, in particular the Hazaras, previously marginalized, discriminated, and persecuted against by successive Afghan governments, were able to seek and thrive from opportunities to education and employment. However, with the return of the Taliban, women in the country described their new lives under the regime as prisoners of their own gender. While the news cycles have moved on, the Taliban repression is only getting more restrictive and more aggressive. Afghan women and girls have already seen a steady elimination of their rights and status within society, once again confined to their own homes. Despite pledges to respect women's rights, the oppression of women and girls by the Taliban have intensified since their retake of the country in August of last year, and their relentless crackdown on women's rights persists in March. The Taliban have imposed severe restrictions on women's mobility and ability to travel, have banned women's sports, abolished the Women's Affairs Ministry, prohibited women and girls from pursuing secondary and tertiary level education, and banned women from most areas of employment. Further, the Taliban have recently been conducting arbitrary arrests and abductions of women's human rights defenders and activists, and while some have been released, many others continue to remain missing. As former First Lady Laura Bush put it on March 8, 2002, on the occasion of International Women's Day, and I quote, "Afghanistan under the Taliban gave the world a sobering example of a country where women were denied their rights and their place in society." Currently, 23 million Afghans are on the brink of famine, and 1 million children are at risk of dying without immediate life-saving treatment. As we've heard before, almost half of Afghans face extreme levels of hunger, with some families selling their babies to purchase food and other necessities. Many women in many provinces have been compelled to sell their own kidneys, although selling them for much less than men, for less than $1,500 an organ. That money is still not enough, so they're forced to sell their children. As an example, in Ghazni province, one woman has sold her 2 daughters and a kidney in order to feed her family. As we've heard before by previous speakers, the situation of women and girls is of particular concern. And as global attention diverts elsewhere in the world, they must not be forgotten. Women and children continue to bear the brunt of the violence and make up more than half of all civilian casualties. They continue to be at risk of targeted attacks by the Taliban and other groups. Afghanistan has been the deadliest place for children over the past 6 years. Across the world, women frequently eat less, last and least well within their households, and suffer the most from nutrition deficiencies. In Afghanistan, women are struggling to feed their families as the country faces an emergency hunger crisis. A staggering 95% of the population is not eating sufficient food, with that percentage likely to rise to 100% for female-headed households. Farmers and harvesters have not yet recovered from the drought which occurred in 2018, while the year coming is projected to be much worse. International donors have suspended aid to the country, and the economy is on the verge of collapse. In terms of education, over the past 20 years, progress has been made with millions of girls receiving an education. But over that past year, attacks on schools, educational centers, villages, and with the return of the Taliban and the collapse of the Republic, that has absolutely withdrawn. It is feared now that 1 million children are already missing on education. As the UN Secretary General recently warned, Afghanistan is hanging by a thread as millions of impoverished citizens struggle to survive amid deteriorating humanitarian conditions. While the Taliban have stated their hope for schools to reopen next week, this dream seems a distant reality for the millions of Afghan girls deprived of their education. But women and girls in Afghanistan have tasted the flavors of freedom and education over the past 20 years, which is why they judge that the risks that they're taking today by protesting on the streets and speaking out are worth it. women and girls continue to resist the Taliban and fight against their repression. Despite the harsh realities which persist in Afghanistan, women and girls continue to be hopeful and optimistic nonetheless. And as a last point, I would like to bring to your attention the issue of aid distribution in the country. During my research, I've come across many reports that discrimination in the distribution of aid, of humanitarian aid in Afghanistan, is a serious but rather neglected issue. There are many accounts from local people in places like Baikundi, in Ghor, and in Ghazni on how they are deselected to receive aid. So donors can play a crucial role to promote aid, to promote equality in aid allocation and distribution. We must note that an enormous gap in aid funding must be filled so that particularly women and children can receive better protection and meet their essential needs. Shireen, I'll stop there and happy to answer any questions in the Q&A session.
Thank you so much, Satara. I think everyone's speaking today, I think the real main point is the fear of Afghanistan being forgotten. That's a theme that I've noticed across everyone's talks. I think that is a really relevant one. And obviously there's not an easy solution for that for us, but I think it's really important to be getting out there and speaking. So thank you, and thank all of you today for actually talking. So I'm going to remind everyone that is in the audience today to please be pushing through your questions in the Q&A section. So there's the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screens. Please do send them through because we will now turn over to the Q&A portion. So we'll get through as many of these as we can as we go through. And I want to particularly ask the questions that are directed to all of our panelists so that everyone has the opportunity to feed in. And I think one of the first that came through is perhaps certainly the resounding question that I have, having listened to everyone talking today, and I think it's arguably the most important. The resounding question we're getting is, what can people do? And the question in particular is coming from people like students who do not have the capacity to financially contribute, but still want to help. So the question is, what now? What can they do? So I'll open that up to all of our panelists. Would anyone like to start? Thank you.
So in my opinion, there are three ways that ordinary citizens can help, particularly women and children in the country. I think the first thing that you can do is hear directly from them, listen to them, listen to their voices and their stories. In an era of social media, follow them on social media and use your platforms to elevate their voices and their priorities. Secondly, if you have the means, of course, is to donate to civil society organizations, particularly those who are working at the grassroots level in remote and in marginalized areas of the country where, as I said, aid distribution is not being met. And thirdly, be an advocate in your own community and in your own networks. Lobby with your government officials to include Afghans at particular risk, women and children, in resettlement and humanitarian programs, as we have seen. We're really struggling with the Australian government.
Thank you, Satara. And Asuntha?
Yeah, just one more thing from my side is now with the growing crisis in most of the countries, like especially Ukraine crisis, what Afghans need is a hope from the global communities to say, we will stay with you. That's the hope and the commitment they need. So maybe some use of social media to pass on this information that we stay with the Afghan communities will give a lot of hope to the people here.
Thank you. And Victor?
Thank you. That's a great question. Financial resources coming to countries is one aspect, an important aspect, of course. But the other aspect, the International Humanitarian Law, or International Human Rights Law, is binding every human being across the world. That includes every citizen in Australia. I would like them to ask questions how once one government is reaching out in a creative way in a specific situation Afghanistan is facing. with a government that is not recognized, but the highest humanitarian needs, how do we creatively, the taxpayers' money can be spent in the communities there? So those type of assess as a citizen, I would like them to ask those questions among themselves, as well as all the government across the world, including their own government.
Excellent. Thank you, Victor. Zola.
Thank you. I will add to the chorus of using your voice. I think it's important right now that with the number of crises that are going on and the attention that's happening right now with Ukraine, that we find a way to talk about Afghanistan that shares the perspective of, we're asking people to sort of widen their aperture, right? We're not asking people to choose between one crisis or another, but really to look at the global crisis in terms of how things like food insecurity will further impact Afghanistan. The food insecurity that will be created by the crisis in Ukraine and Russia will impact Afghanistan. And so we need to see these as related issues. The other area I think is to look at some very tangible touch points with government. I mentioned the Senate report that's coming out, and I just received a notification that report is now due to come out on April 5th. I'll put the link in the chat so that you can follow when that is due to come out. But that's a really important point to see how the government is saying that they're going to be supporting Afghanistan, engaging with Afghanistan, and at that time, really use your voice to say, this is not enough, or this is more of what we need to see. So there are points in time where you can be strategic with your voice. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, Zola. And Semin.
Yeah, thank you, Shireen. Actually, I totally agree with what colleagues just mentioned. I don't think I have anything new to add to it, but just want to note that what people can do is, was also already noted, but focus on advocacy and do advocacy at their levels, particularly the governments are the ones that are making decisions. So how we are working with the governments to advocate on behalf of the Afghan people. Policies usually are made based on the interests, but we know how much they impact on the lives of people back in countries like Afghanistan. So for policies that are friendly and that are in the benefit of the common people, they're really important. And public can play that critical role of being advocates on behalf of the people who need their support. And in this case, it's the people of Afghanistan.
Thank you. Well, given that the main thrust there was giving voice and using social media and the like, this leads beautifully into one of the other questions we've been asked, which is in terms of with social media and playing that part in sharing stories, are there any ethical guidelines or best practice recommendations that any of you would make about actually sharing stories and imagery ethically? Because obviously there are potential challenges, especially when you're showing people suffering and the like. Semin? I don't know if my hand was still up, sorry.
No, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I just want to note here that Afghans were going through conflict for the last 2 decades. People were living in conflict for the last 4 decades. So it's a long-term thing for us as Afghans. And last 20 years were I think I would say they were the years of a lot of development for Afghanistan. Of course, things were not easy. There were lots of challenges. There was lots of issues, but still it was an opportunity for the society to develop after like spending years in civil war and in conflict. Afghans have changed a lot. There were opportunities and they've developed a lot. It's important, of course, when you do fundraising, particularly organizations that who do fundraising, they have to show that the country is going through devastation. But it's also important, I think, to use the positive changes that happened in the last 20 years. And despite of everything that happened, Paul, on 15th of August, you do see those strengths still there. I mean, we have seen women who were protesting for their rights, who were asking for or demanding for the dignity that they want. And these are some of the positive changes that we see among youth, among women. And this could be a good portrayal of international community support to Afghanistan that shows if you're supporting in the right way, you can actually achieve the positive result out of it. So I think we need to also show the positive aspects, the strengths of the people of Afghanistan, because we have been going through these conflicts for 4 decades, for 40 years. And we are really resilient people. We have resilience. We fell, but we also know how to stand back. And this is the story that needs to be shown to the world as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Asuntha?
Yeah, just to highlight the resilience of the Afghan communities to be more positive, like not only showing the negative aspects, but also to give them some kind of a positive approach of how they have really survived all these situations. And we have seen that commitment. And secondly, recently we have also seen that how de facto are not very happy when the children, and especially women and girl children, are shown in the media or in the Facebook page. So they are coming up with a lot of restrictions. So maybe that needs to be considered so that people inside the country are not affected.
Thank you. Satara.
Thanks, Shireen. I echo the previous speaker's comments. I just wanted to point out one more thing. I think it's important when talking about these issues and for on Afghanistan in general, is to avoid tokenism. I think I've seen that a lot in recent times, if I may be honest, that we merely have people on panels just for the sake of inclusion or diversification of things. As Semin mentioned, we Afghans are educated, intelligent, resilient, you name it. Lawyers, doctors, engineers, everything. So it's, there's qualifications, there's achievements that can be highlighted and that can be shared. So it's best not to put people on panels or as speakers just for the sake of it, but really acknowledge the hard work and the strides that Afghan women have made over the last 20 years.
Mm-hmm. I suppose I'll speak in as a white woman to also stress we shouldn't be substituting our voices for yours, that obviously in all circumstances we should be allowing your voices to be heard rather than trying to make our own points, as I would suggest.
Absolutely. Elevate and amplify.
Yes, exactly. Zola.
Yeah, I was actually jumping in to say just that as a white woman who is not from Afghanistan, I really wanted to second Sitarah's earlier point about the importance of following Afghan voices, listening and hearing when people are giving messages that they say want amplified, and then responding in that way instead of assuming that we know best. The other thing is that as a child rights organization, our organization has a very strict vetting process in terms of ensuring that children and families are asked and have given consent to use their image, to use their voices. And so when selecting stories to share, make sure that you're also looking at what the source is, and that they are from reputable sources that have gone through that vetting process.
Excellent. I suppose the conflict we're seeing in Ukraine and the information about how much misinformation gets shared in conflict situations kind of highlights that as well, of how important it is to be careful and verify what you're actually sharing. Victor.
Yeah, I think the most have said it. The principle and benchmark and ethics is what an Afghan want to say about himself or herself. It is their story. There is a multiple experience, negative and positive. And we like to see whatever they want to say, we need to highlight. There could be positive, there could be negative. And all of us will be shocked the courage they have. We think they do not have the courage, but they like to speak out. They would like to say, place my photograph, place my statement. I think therefore we need to remain true to themselves, not apply our own benchmark and filter what they have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question that's not too surprising that is coming through is people are interested in the challenges of working with the Taliban and what experiences might be being experienced at the moment of trying to do humanitarian work with the current government in Afghanistan. So would anyone like to speak to that? Semin? So you're on mute.
Sorry, yeah. Actually, I can share the experience that UN Women had a few weeks ago, and I'm sure they might have this issue even now. It is very challenging to work with the de facto government, particularly when it's an issue concerning women and girls. A lot of people who are in the government are now those who are members of the Taliban and now in the government. It's extremely difficult for them to understand the issues of women and girls. They are basing their decisions based on whatever perceptions they have. So it's really hard for them to understand when we talk about women's rights, when we talk about women's issues, what those issues are. And they need a lot of education. For them, women, particularly when it comes to issues related to gender-based violence, it's something they don't understand at all. You have to actually speak to them about poverty. You have to speak to them about women not having or families not having food to eat. I mean, these are the things that they understand. So you have to start any conversation with them using simple terms that people are living in poverty. There are women who need, if you're talking about safe spaces for women, it's something that they don't understand. You have to actually start using, very, simple things to make them understand these issues. However, I think the other issue that is also a big problem at the moment, that a lot of their foot soldiers don't understand. It's hard to work with them, while people who are in the government high positions, they can pick the issue, but they hardly can actually convey the message to their foot soldiers. People who are at a high level, high officials in the government, though they might not be willing to focus on particularly or work or allow women to or work on women programming so much, but they know that if they don't do this, they are not going to be recognized by the international community. So one thing that they are at the moment focusing so much, and we see this so much at the capitals, that we have seen this in the last few months, that women were able to go out and protest. They were facing a lot of challenges. We have seen some of the developments in terms of opening of the universities, and in a couple of weeks girls will start going to school. These are happening at the level where they want international community to see and then recognize them. But if it goes if we go down to really working with them on these issues, it's extremely challenging because, as I said, a lot of their people, for them, it's really difficult to understand or make linkages between the issues that are discussed and then the practicality of it.
Thank you. Satara.
Thanks, Shireen. Two things I wanted to highlight. Firstly, in terms of the status of women and girls in Afghanistan, we might remember that during the regime of the late 1990s, the Taliban imposed the burqa, and women were compelled to wear the burqa when they left their homes. So that burqa is a symbol of, for women, it's a symbol of individualism, and with the Taliban's thinking, women don't have a place within the public life. They're confined to their homes, to their private spheres, to their domestic roles. So in terms of working with the Taliban for women's rights and girls' education and so forth, it's incredibly difficult to do that because they don't believe in the role of women being active in society. They think that women should be confined to homes, that they should play their domestic roles. Last month, their decree in Ghazni stated that women should stay at home and they should just, do their domestic roles, raise kids, etc., etc. So that's the type of thinking that the Taliban have, and unfortunately, it's very difficult to challenge or even to discuss anything related to women's rights with them. Secondly, the Taliban are a Sunni conservative movement, predominantly dominated by one ethnic group, which is the Pashtuns. And so for other ethnic communities in the country, like the Uzbeks, the Tajiks, the Hazaras, and other minority groups, it's incredibly difficult to work with them because they do not consider other groups to be part of Afghanistan. Their infamous saying in the late 1990s went that Uzbeks should go to Uzbekistan, Tajiks should go to Tajikistan, and Hazaras should go to Goristan. Goristan is actually the Pashto word for cemetery. So that's the type of thinking that the Taliban have, and that's extremely dangerous.
Thank you. Victor.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very, very good question, very tricky question for all of us. We cannot ignore the fact at this point of time, we have a de facto government, not yet accepted internationally, but still we may need to work with them. Organization like CARE and many others, CARE was there from 1961 operating in Afghanistan, and we worked both within the government controlled area as well as Taliban controlled areas. But we wouldn't speak to the Taliban. Who speaks on behalf of us is the community. The community understands what we want to do, what we want to serve, how it is benefiting them, and they will talk in the language that Taliban understands at that time. So now we are interacting with them, as my panelist rightly said. We need to explain, and if I want to use the harsh word, educate, but to go along with them to see how we can explain to them. I give you an example. They will say, why are you selecting people? You are discriminating. You come and give to entire village the supply you want to give. Very, very neat logic. But if you explain to them, look, you have 1,000 households and I happen to have at this point of 300 household material available. Therefore, these are the needs that assessment criteria we have. Can we do it? Maybe once, second time you explain, they understand, yes. Now it is not a discrimination, but it is you are applying certain principles and we agree. So I think that is going to be the way all along, but that does not mean that the Taliban is one group. It's a diverse group with diverse thinking. There is a conservative, there is a free people. I think we need to see how we can creatively work, with whom we work, at what point of time we work, etc. I think that's why I said it's tricky, but that's something that all of us know how we can do it, because we have been doing it all along, not only in Afghanistan, across the world.
Thank you. Asuntha?
Yeah, just to share from where Victor left, like even with World Vision, we have been working, at least 60% of our work in the past was in Taliban controlled areas. So somehow we have been working in those areas. But what we realize is now they are a government. So whether it's a de facto or anything, they are the government. So their ways of working are completely different now. And we have to also understand they are very much decentralized. So in every province, they have different rules, different regulations. So we have to really have our own creative mechanisms to explain to them things. And in many of the places, like even during August 15th and after that, I stayed back in the country. So I had to start talking to them in person. So in many ways, like when you talk to them, they are able to understand, especially why do you need women staff? So you have to explain, like, how do we manage to treat your women if there are no women nurses or women doctors, because you don't allow your women to be treated by a man. So those are the type of conversations which helps us to really convince them that it's not that without any logic that we want to do things, but there is a logic, but at the same time, we have no compromises, and we cannot leave women who have so much of capacity and who have contributed so much to this country. We cannot leave them behind. So we have to communicate regularly. And I think I'm hopeful that it's a slow process, but we will somewhere find a solution to it.
It's always good to hear the messages of hope and that encouragement going forward. Zola?
Yeah, I'm just reflecting on what some of our colleagues here have said, and I think that it's an interesting moment in time, because historically, or at least for quite a while, our governments have looked to ways to delegitimize the Taliban, and there is a fear of engaging with the Taliban as a way that legitimizes the government. But without doing that, we create a vacuum. As so many people have said, they are the government now. And if we're not willing to learn how to have these engagements and have very challenging conversations, it's very complex. But otherwise, they will govern without our voices. They will continue in their role as government without our input and without our expertise. And so I think we're at a moment in time where it's a very difficult needle to thread, where we're still looking for ways where we're not saying this is the legitimate government, but we want to ensure that we're putting protections in place and we're putting those services in place. And so I think that there's just I really applaud our colleagues here who are working on the ground and having these conversations and advocating for the services that they're delivering.
Thank you, Zola. Satara.
Sorry, Shireen, if I may just add a point quickly. While I appreciate all the work that's been happening by international organizations in the country, I think it's also important that we distinguish between the interactions and the engagement that ordinary Afghans have with the Taliban in comparison to foreigners. And we know foreigners get privileges by virtue of their passports, of the organizations for which they work for, that ordinary Afghans do not get, unfortunately. If I was in Afghanistan as an Afghan woman, I wouldn't get the treatment that a white person would get working for UNHCR, for example. So I think it's important that we underscore that and we really highlight the issue there in terms of the inconsistency, and really that underscores the reality that the Taliban are pursuing in terms of gaining international trust and legitimacy, and that is by through their PR and media work that they do, which is often done through international organizations.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. I think it's really important to keep in mind. Given that we're running short of time for asking questions, I'm going to ask the final one. That one is very near and dear to my heart, which I suppose is a perspective on the ground. What value have you seen for international law? So obviously, most particularly international humanitarian law and international human rights law. What value has it played, do you think, in providing anything of hope or positivity on the ground in Afghanistan? Or for the matter where you've seen it fail? Zola?
Well, I think some of the what we saw from the UN Security Council and the humanitarian exemptions that came through in order to allow funds to humanitarian actors on the ground was really amazing work by a large number of humanitarian actors and IHL supporters. And, that was really no small feat. I think, we are still waiting to see with the new UNAMA funding cycle, which, what will happen to future funding. We're still waiting to see how banks over time will respond to the humanitarian exemption. We know, banks were sort of given the rights to allow funds to flow into the country, but banks by their nature are risk averse, and so didn't, unsurprisingly did not take that up. And so we're still seeing a liquidity crisis in Afghanistan. But I think, I was heartened by the humanitarian community and the IHL community and being able to pressure the Security Council and making that change rapidly.
Great. Victor?
Yeah, well, we thank and appreciate all the efforts that have gone based on the basic foundation of humanitarian law as well as human rights. Now it's time that we need to go beyond while we try to make sure that humanitarian exemptions are given to reach out to those needs. But we see a situation of all basic system either have collapsed or collapsing. That includes banking system that has been talked about, health system, education system. At the same time, we have a situation where we cannot engage with the current de facto government by various governments and donors. So now if we assert these rights, foundational rights, we can only highlight as humanitarian and development activists the needs here. We are not politicians here, but we like to have a more of that political will to find a way of engaging with Afghanistan, find a way of trusting and having comfort with those frontline organizations, both NGOs, INGOs who are on the ground, how to assist them. At times it becomes easy for me to convince a taxpayer who wants Afghan to be helped. But the policy of a particular government comes heavily on the way. So what is it that we can do collectively to go beyond and understand and see the humanitarian needs are met, the basic system that we built last 20 years are sustained. Otherwise, we are going to redo again another 30 years, what has, if we allow it to collapse. Thank you.
Thank you. Semin?
Yeah, I actually want to echo on just what Victor said this and what Zola was also mentioning. It's really great to see that there are some humanitarian exemptions, and but that's not enough. Honestly, as I was noting it, I think earlier too, that Afghanistan was going through conflict for 40 years. Last 20 years, a lot was done. The systems, the basic systems were built. And now we see that we are gone back to where we started. And having like all these restrictions and sanctions on Afghanistan is actually impacting the people more than the government or people who are sitting and governing. I don't think these restrictions and sanctions impact the head of the government at the moment. Not at all. They don't care. They don't have their families living in Afghanistan. It's not going to impact on them anyways. Actually, who is impacted? It's the people of Afghanistan, those who are going through extremely difficult time right now. So the governments definitely need to, I mean, this is an opportunity for the governments to think, because they invested, particularly the international community invested 20 years. They've spent millions of dollars in Afghanistan. They've had human resources there who supported with the development. And now by putting sanctions and restricting Afghanistan, putting sanctions on Afghanistan, it seems like we are going back to where we started 20 years ago. And then also, I just wanted to also note it here that
you seem to have frozen, Semin, unfortunately. Yeah, unfortunately, we seem to be having some audio issues, Semin.
Can you hear me?
Oh, there we go. Now it's working again.
Oh, okay. So I don't know where I got frozen. So
I was sort of just your last sort of sentence sort of just cut off, and you just unfortunately frozen again by the looks of it. So I might actually turn to Satara and hope that yours might stabilize in the interim.
Thanks, Shireen. I echo our previous speakers' comments regarding this question. I just wanted to point out in terms of the legitimacy, as I mentioned before, the legitimacy and the trust in which the Taliban is currently craving, you know, how through their engagements with the European Union, their visit to Oslo last month, or I think it was in January, their engagements in Doha and other capital cities around the world, they're ultimately at the core of their movement at the moment is that they're wanting international legitimacy and international trust in them. So ultimately that falls on the rest of the international community to not allow that to be granted to them. And as Semin mentioned, unfortunately, what's happening at the moment is that people on the ground, particularly women and children and those in marginalized areas, are suffering and are being discriminated against, as I said, aid distribution and others. So it really is important that the international community keeps pressure on the Taliban to ensure that any form of legitimacy going forward, and you know, I say that very loosely, is tied with commitments, with robust commitments to gender equality and to women's rights protection.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Asuntha.
Yeah, just to highlight that still the human rights issue is something challenging in this country, because the recent house-to-house searches have really created a lot of disturbance among our own colleagues, like especially among female colleagues, why these house-to-house searches are being done. Though there is an explanation, but though people don't believe. So sometimes people are disappearing and we don't see them again. So these type of issues are there. Maybe it's not being highlighted now very much in the media because now Ukraine has taken over the media attention. But I think now we have to be mindful, such lack of media security of every Afghan national is highly crucial, and especially of women. And this is something that continues to be a challenge. And I fear that if the media is not going to attend to Afghanistan, those cases are going to increase. That's my real worry.
Thank you. So to wrap up, we just wanted to give everyone the opportunity to make some final statements, any sort of roundup messaging that you would like to make. We might go in the same order that the original presentations were done, although hopefully we've obviously lost Semin for the moment. She might be able to join us back if we leave her till last. So Victor, are there any final comments you'd like to make?
Yeah, I just want to reiterate both international human rights law and international human rights humanitarian law is equally applicable to every citizen across the world and every government They will have to find a creative and innovative way of working in Afghanistan today in the current context where you have a government that is not accepted by them, but you have a high level of humanitarian needs. And you have an organization working on the ground for years. How do we trust and place comfort in them? And therefore the humanitarian needs as well as collapsing basic systems are addressed. Otherwise, we will be speaking on rights, but in vacuum. Resources are important. We need more resources to Afghanistan. At the same time, how do we have the resources come into the country and every supply is available there? And that's also important. Therefore, how do we make sure the collapsing system, starting from banking system onwards, can be supported? Find a way of supporting so that we can get those resources and actually reach out to the people in need. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome back, Semin. Are there any final comments and perhaps even just wrapping up the original point that you were cut off on that you'd like to make in closing?
Yeah, actually, yeah, I don't know where I got cut, but I just wanted to say that we my point was mainly on the sanctions, that of course there are sanctions, and we do understand why there are sanctions, but we also need to make sure that the sanctions are not impacting the people, because at the moment they are impacting the actual people. It's not going to do any harm to the government or to the ruling government. It's actually making impact on the lives of the people of Afghanistan. So there needs to be certain ways where we could continue supporting the people of Afghanistan, and we don't go back from where we started 20 years ago. We came a long way, so it's not the time to go back, because if we go back, it means that the investment that was made in the last 20 years, they're all, yeah, we lost them all. So we just need to make sure that what people are going now through, we are able to get them out of the situation.
Thank you. Asuntha.
Yeah, I would like to say the human rights is really respected and every Afghan national is safe in this country. The safety and the security of every Afghan national is so very crucial, especially for women. And secondly, I have no second thoughts that humanitarian aid is very much essential because of the crisis on the ground. But Afghanistan doesn't deserve to be a dependent country always. It has been a donor-funded country, and that shouldn't really continue for long. We should support this country to become self-reliant and help each Afghan to have a self-dignified life. So that would be my real request. And having lived and worked in Afghanistan for more than 7 years, I have seen a lot of capacities, knowledge, talent, and aspirations in every Afghan. So I think we have, as a global community, we have a huge responsibility to stand with every Afghan at this crucial moment and make sure that their talents are recognized, their capacities are utilized, and their aspirations are made a reality. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Zola.
Thank you. I guess I would just like to close by saying, one, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to our conversation and engaging with us. And I hope that you will continue to engage on this topic and to be committed to Afghanistan and to use your voice. We need the same kind of global uprising of support for this country to say that this matters, to say that these children matter. And as Asuntha was just saying, these children deserve the right to live freely, to enjoy their lives and to thrive in the future. And that's been stolen from them. We can predict already that 1 million children can die this year from malnutrition. And that was before the Ukraine crisis. That was before additional food insecurities created by that. So we really need a global community to use their voice to speak to government about why this matters. So thank you for everything that you're doing, being here, and everything you'll do in the future.
Thank you. And last but not least, Satara.
Thanks, Shireen. Also echoing Zola's points in terms of keeping up the pressure on discussions around Afghanistan for Afghan people. It's really important that as news cycles move on, that we keep spotlight on Afghanistan so that the Taliban do not get away with their human rights atrocities, that they be held accountable by the international community. It's important that the international community, Australia playing a huge role in it, keeps up pressure on the group that at no cost, while they're committing human rights atrocities, perpetrating violence against women and children, that they're not given legitimacy in the international community and global community more widely. I think those are my last points. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and to share the platform.
Thank you. I think that's an excellent point to end on. So I do now need to close out our proceedings today. Before I do, I want to thank on behalf of everyone who's here today, thank profusely our speakers for your time and insights today, but also just for all the work you do more generally. I don't think humanitarian workers and human rights workers get enough acknowledgement for what they do. So please do know that there are those of us that do know and value everything that you do. And I think I speak comfortably on behalf of everyone today when I say that I'll be coming away with much to think about thanks to this panel, and that I do not plan to forget Afghanistan. I don't think anyone that heard you speak today will be forgetting Afghanistan anytime soon. And you've all given us things that we all can do to try and help. So thank you for that. I'd also like to thank those behind the scenes today. So again, thanking UNSW Institute for Human Rights for hosting this part of the series, and particularly Sarah Williams, who made it possible, and Drew Sheldrick, who has been behind the scenes today, providing the logistical support to make sure that this has run smoothly. And of course, thank you to the Australian Red Cross for creating and running this series. So particular shout outs to Janet Craven, who's actually been organising this from Ireland, and she's on the panel at the webinar today, despite the fact that this started at 4 AM in Irish time. And Laurie Maybe, who was also in the wings today in case we needed a Red Cross voice and was ready to stand in and speak up if need be. So finally, I'd like to mention that there are 2 more webinars planned for this series coming up. So from the link that you registered with today, you might have seen that on the 30th of March, there will be a webinar on refugees and internally displaced people. And on the 13th of April, there will be one on healthcare in danger in Afghanistan. I, for one, cannot wait for those series, so please do register for them. So thank you all so much for coming along today and listening, and I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. So thank you, that's all from us today. Thank you again.